So once again, we're back, and I'm here today to talk to you about a primary source. This is a primary source. What I've done is I've taken a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Father Bartolomeo de las Casas, which is a primary source that's been assigned to you to read, and I've put it in a Microsoft Word document so that hopefully we can sort of deal with it a little bit and talk about how to read it using the method that we talked about in the How to Read a Primary Source video, which was, remember, paper, purpose and motives of the author, argument and strategy that she or he uses to achieve those goals, presuppositions and values in the text, epistemology, and relate to other texts. So there's plenty to dig out in here, and I think it's time that we just get started. So here we are. The Americas were discovered in 1492 and the first Christian settlements established by the Spanish the following year. It is accordingly 49 years now since the Spaniards began arriving in numbers in this part of the world. So, interesting. De las Casas is talking to us right now about when he is and where he is. Let's go on. They first settled, they being the Spanish, they first settled the large and fertile lands of Hispaniola, which boasts 600 leagues of coastline and is surrounded by a great many other large islands, all of them, as I saw for myself, with as high a native population as anywhere on earth. Of the coast of the mainland, which at its nearest point is a little over 250 leagues from Hispaniola, more than 10,000 leagues had been explored by 1541, and more are being discovered every day. This coastline, too, was swarming with people, and it would seem, if we are to judge by those areas so far explored, that the Almighty selected this part of the world as home to the greatest part of the human race. So De las Casas here is sort of setting the stage. But if we go back to paper and we take a look at reading a primary source using paper, right, one of the things we have to think about is the purpose and motives of the author and figure out whether we can decide what the purpose and motives of De las Casas are without first referring to anything from outside of the text of this article. Now that's going to be a little bit hard, but I think we can come up with some purposes, right? At least we can tell right now that De las Casas is doing some interesting things. Okay? One of the interesting things he does is he gives us this outline of the time period that he's talking about and how long it's been since the Spanish started to arrive in numbers in the New World. But he does this thing right here. I'm going to see if I can underline it so that you can see it. He says they first settled in large and fertile island of Hispaniola, right? And in fact, this is the word that I really want to focus on, the word they, all right? De las Casas was a Spaniard, and he came over with the same people that he's talking about after 1492, and certainly before he started writing this particular document. But he doesn't refer to the Spanish as we, he refers to them as they. That's really interesting, and it probably has something to do with the way that De las Casas is thinking about his job as an author and why he is writing this document, right? So it helps us with this paper question, right? Purpose. What is his purpose? But let's dig into a little bit more. If we go back here, we can begin to think about what De las Casas' purpose is by trying to come up with an idea of what he is trying to say in this paragraph altogether. So one of the key things that I've noticed as we read this is that he says of the coast of the mainland, which at its nearest point is a little over 250 leagues from Hispaniola, so that's kind of an aside. The distance is important to a navigator, but not important to us for this purpose, right? He says, though, and this is critical, he says, more than 10,000 leagues has been explored and more being discovered every day. More than that, right, he says this coastline too was swarming with people. Okay? And he says, if we are to judge by those areas so far explored, that the Almighty selected this part of the world as home to the greater part of the human race. That suggests there's a ton of people there, right? He says this as well, large and fertile island of Hispaniola, which boasts 600 leagues of coastline. Hispaniola is what is now Haiti, and is surrounded by a great many other large islands, all of them, as far as I saw for myself, with as high a native population as anywhere on earth. Okay. So this doesn't yet quite explain to us what his purpose is. But we can see that he's very interested in the amount of people who lived in the Americas before the Spanish arrived, and he's interested in chronicling the amount of time that it has taken the Spanish to become active in the Americas. So that could help us figure out his purpose. Let's read a little bit more and see if we can get there. God, it says, made all the peoples of this area, many and varied as they are, as open and innocent as can be imagined. Okay, I'm going to take a big guess here, and I'm even going to color this slightly differently. I'll call this green. This sounds very much like de las Casas' opinion of these people. And I think that's great, right? I mean, we have his idea of what these people look like. Remember, de las Casas was a priest. I know that comes from outside of the document. And so for analyzing this primary source, that's kind of breaking the rules a little bit, but it's important for us to know who this author is. He's a priest, a Catholic priest. But he is really interested here in the fact that these people are open and innocent as can be imagined. And I think that that's not just an opinion. That's something that he wants us to know because he's going to tell us something about it in the later in the letter. The simplest people in the world, unassuming, long-suffering, unassertive, and submissive, they are without malice or guile, right? Without malice or guile. Now, one of the things that de las Casas would have recognized as he arrived in the New World is that the Spanish that he came with were wearing, when they could afford them, hats that were made of steel, breastplates that were made of steel. They carried swords. They carried weapons that were ballistic weapons. They were prepared for war. And of course, that's not a great surprise given the situation in Europe at the time. So he's contrasting these Americans who are, he says, innocent, without malice or guile, guile being the willingness to lie to get what they want, malice being the willingness to hurt others. And he's kind of contrasting that with the people that he's ridden over to the Americas with on the ships. That's an interesting contrast, and he's definitely expressing his opinion, but also that opinion is based on his observations. So it's useful to us. He says they're utterly faithful and obedient, both to their own native lords and to the Spaniards, in whose service they now find themselves. Never quarrelsome or belligerent or boisterous, they harbor no grudges and do not seek to settle old scores. Indeed, the notions of revenge, rancor, and hatred are quite foreign to them. At the same time, they are among the least robust of human beings. They're not big and powerful, according to him. Their delicate constitutions make them unable to withstand hard work or suffering and render them liable to succumb to almost any illness, no matter how mild. Now, this is interesting right here because, of course, we know today, and again, this is sort of from outside of the text, so I guess I'll have to ask you to forgive me bringing this in from outside the text, but it comments on something that's in the text, so it's probably worthwhile. Essentially, what's important is to recognize that he sees these people as becoming ill rather easily. They were, and that's because they didn't have natural immunity to the diseases that the Spanish were bringing over, and that's because of 40,000 years of separation between the natives who had settled the Americas and the natives who had stayed in Europe. So that's a very interesting and important point. De las Casas is already recognizing that Native Americans get sick easily if compared to Spanish. And that's not because the Spanish have a stronger constitution, but because they've developed immunity. So if we dig back into this, we can see that de las Casas is making this really interesting contrast, right? And in fact, he does the contrast here. Even the common people are no tougher than the princes or other Europeans born with a silver spoon in their mouths. So Europeans born with a silver spoon in their mouths would be aristocrats, wealthy people who don't have to work, and he's comparing common Americans to Europeans who don't have to work and therefore have what he thinks of as a weak constitution, have difficulty surviving without food, have difficulty surviving hard work, etc. Even the common people are no tougher than princes or Europeans born with a silver spoon in their mouths and who spend their lives shielded from the rigors of the outside world. Now, again, this might suggest to us something about these Native Americans that de las Casas has met, and that would be that they may not have to work as hard as Europeans do for basic subsistence. They may have a situation in which the agriculture that they do is both not particularly difficult and provides everything that they need. But, and here's another contrast that de las Casas makes, right? They are also among the poorest people on the face of the earth. So he doesn't see them as wealthy at all. Even though they're not wealthy, they still are not used to hard work. From our point of view, as people reading this after the fact, we can begin to think of the different reasons why the Spanish might be used to working very hard, whereas the Taino might not be used to working as hard. They own next to nothing and have no urge to acquire material possessions. This is, again, an interesting observation by de las Casas. No urge to acquire material possessions. He probably brings this up because it is in great contrast with the culture of Europeans who really are in America because of the urge to possess material possessions. They're looking for gold. If they don't find gold, they're looking for land, and they're looking for people, slaves, to work that land. So de las Casas has done some interesting things here. If we go back to paper and see what we can find out, maybe we can find out some interesting things. In paper, right, the purpose and motives of the author. Well, this begins to seem clear at this point. The purpose and the motive of the author seems to be that we're contrasting Native Americans with Spanish. And he's making a kind of anthropological comparison of the two cultures, finding out how they are different from each other, and maybe wondering why. What's his argument? It's not completely clear yet what his argument is. And if we go further down in the paper, we'll begin to see that he's going to argue that Native Americans are people too, that they're human, and that they shouldn't be used as slaves, that they are being mistreated by the Spanish, who are really only looking for gold. And these people seem to be poor. They also don't seem to be interested in fighting. They have a culture very different from the Spanish, which he thinks suggests that the Spanish are kind of barking up the wrong tree. But you'll have to read further in the article to get that. What are his presuppositions and values? Well, I think the text tells us quite a bit about his presuppositions and values. If we switch over again to the document, we can see that he's surprised that these Native Americans have no malice or guilt, that he is surprised that they are open and innocent. He's probably surprised at the lack of clothing that they wear, although that's just a guess. That's not here in the document as far as we have read. He is surprised that they are not warlike. He is surprised that they're obedient to the Spanish, and he's surprised that they're not used to the hard work, even if they're common farming people. So his presuppositions are really entirely based on what he would expect from commoners in Spanish farms and in Spanish villages, that these people are hardworking, that they have to work hard for just survival, and so are used to being ground under the boot of aristocrats, that the only Spanish who are not hardworking and who don't have to have calluses on their hands and have to have these powerful bodies, the only Europeans like that are aristocrats. So he's got these presuppositions that are based on European class, that are based on the difficulty of farming in Europe, that are based on the taxes owed by European farmers and commoners to the aristocrats, and he's surprised by the way that the Native Americans don't fit that. So paper suggests too that we need to figure out the epistemology. To what degree is this truthful? All right. Well, there is a little bit that we can do here to do that, and of course, depending on the document, more and more and more. But this document gives us not a whole lot to work with. We do have de las Casas' position as a priest in the Catholic Church. Although we can't guarantee it, certainly, we can suppose that to de las Casas, honesty and truthfulness is a very important value. After all, not lying is in the Ten Commandments, and so we should imagine that de las Casas is, to the best of his ability, telling us the truth. He has not done any comparisons here so far that react negatively to the Native Americans or to the Spanish. That is to say, he's really talking about differences, but he doesn't seem to be evaluating them. And that suggests that, at least to some degree, he's a kind of observer and to some degree objective, although he certainly interjects his opinion. So to the degree that we can imagine him as objective and a Catholic priest, we can assume here that he's telling the truth as he sees it anyway. We also have to recognize that he's probably reporting back to the Spanish Catholic Church or the Catholic Church in Rome, and he's also writing this for posterity. So one of the rare primary source documents that's actually being written for us, for you and me. So what does paper say we should do after this? Paper tells us that we need to relate this to other texts, and we will do that in a later episode. I just wanted to have a look at this document to show you what we can sort of take out of a primary source document when we read it carefully. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.